Okay, so we're in Ayin Beis, Perek Mem. Just let me get to the, there we go. All right. Okay, so Ayin Beis Perek Mem. Let me just give a sort of a recap about where we were up to and what we were talking about. Essentially, we're talking about the inyan of Mala Mata in the spheroids, and Mala Mata in the oilamis. One, there's really two inyanim in that. One inyan is that there's an inyan of ribui umiut, like for instance, between the oilamis, oil ma'atzilus is ribui or, like that, bria is miuta or kol shekain yitzira v'asiya, and therefore you have the inyan of Mala Mata. Atzilus, since it's ribui or, that's Mila, and Asiya would be mute, Sheba mute of or, and therefore it would be the inyan of Mata. But that's only one inyan in the inyanim of the inyan of Malo Mata. The Ika inyan in the inyanim of Malo Mata, at least as far as the oil is concerned, is an inyan in Eichus, that there's different levels of Eichus of the oil. Now, when we talk about the difference in Eichus of the oil, what do we mean? So he gives an example. One of the examples he gives is the inyan of moichin. In moichin itself, you get moichin da Abba and moichin da Ima. Abba, moichin da Abba is lamala mehasoga, and lamala mehistalshalus. Mashain kain in Ima, in Yana is dafka shtedi stalshalus. In other words, the difference between them is essentially the inyan of mahus and metzias. That's why he explains it. The inyan of chochmah is mahusa inyan, masha'enkein binah is metzias inyan. It's only in metzias inyan that you have an inyan of ilah ba'alul. You have the inyan of cause and effect in the metzias, but not in mahus. And only in binah metzias do you have the inyan of ishtalshlus per se. There is an inyan, we'll talk about that later, the inyan of how chochmah affects other spheroids, which is really the inyan of Hashra, and we'll talk about that later. But in the meanwhile, we're talking about the inyan of ilah ba'alul, and therefore, primarily, we're talking about the inyan of Metzias, we're talking about the inyan of binah, and we talk about the inyan of Hishtalshus. So there's two inyanim in ilah ba'alul. One inyan in ilah ba'alul that we spoke about before is that the alul is a mhus acher miha ilah. It's a different Metzias, it's a different inyan. For example, Zoh, as it is within binah, in other words, the midos of binah. Now he doesn't say this here, but it's stated like this in other Maimorim, that you get binah and tevuna. What's the difference between binah and tevuna? Binah is binah itself, or gar de'ima, the gimel ration. In other words, chochmah binah das or kesach chochmah binah, depending on what maimah you're talking about of binah. Masha'en kain, the inyan of the midois in binah, chesed gvura tevres netzachod, yesod, and possibly malchus as well, is the inyan of is the inyan of what's called tevuna. The emes is you have the same thing in chochmah, the midois of chochmah called Yisrael Saba, and chochmah itself is called chochmah or Abba. So in the parts of Abba, you have these two inyanim. You have the moichin, you have the midas of Abba. But in any event, we're talking about binah now. So in binah, you have binah and tevuna. It's tevuna where you have this inyan of primarily this inyan of ilah ba'alul. That the inyan in the midas, the way they are in binah, are midos sichlios. They're not midas in the same sense that midas are in Zeranpin, in other words, on the lower madrega, the madrega of midas mamish. Why? Because the inyan of midas mamish is the inyan of hergesh atzmoi. That's the inyan of midos. Midoi losha medida, and one of the inyanim of medida has a shaykh to me. That's how you measure things. What's the shaykh to me? So therefore, the yoiker of the inyan, for example, is not the inyan of midos. The yoiker of the inyan would be the midas the way they are in bina. But the yoiker lagabi ma tov li, that's the inyan of the midos as they are midos b'poel mamish. So that is when the midos as they are emanated, or emanates the wrong word, that's shaykh to atzilus, but the midos as they are manifested, that's the word I'm looking for, the midos as they are manifested in a lower madrega, as midos mamish, let's say in the world of Yitzira, for example, those inyonim of midos are essentially something different from the way they are in the ilah. And therefore the midos in ilah and alul, there's a difference between them, as we explained. But it's not that the midos are ha'ora of binah. The midos are something different from the inyan of binah. It's true that they're kalul in binah as binah is in olam habriya, let's say, but they're not the same. They're not the same inyan, as we said before. The midos in binah is yoker ha'inyan. The midos as they are midos is ma tov li, right? Atov li. Okay, so that's one inyan in ilah v'alul. Another inyan in ilah v'alul is that actually the alul is ha'ora from the ilah. It's ha'ora of the ilah. How does that work? For example, the inyan of seichel. The seichel arav, when it comes to the Talmud, is still seichel. It's not midas. Yeah, only what? It's an aloha madrega. It's only a ha'ora of the seichel harav. It's not the seichel of the Rav himself. Okay. He also explained that this is the difference between midos as they are independent of binah, as they emerge from binah and become, let's say, the midos of olam hayetzira. Those midos, when they're hisgalus, those midos when they're around, that's the inyan of hispilus. Mashenka, the midos as they are in seichel, in binah itself, as they are in binah before they emerge from binah, that's the inyan of dveikus. And essentially, dveikus is not even really the midos of binah; it's more the midos of chochmah. That's the inyan. That's essentially the inyan of dveikus. Okay, so that's more or less the first sug, the first type of ilah v'alul, where the ilah v'alul, where the alul is different from the ilah and is mishtalshel from it, but that's the inyan of metzius. Now, the second oifen in ilah v'alul, where the alul is a ha'ora, like for example in the inyan of seichel, where midos are mishtalshel from seichel, that's not the same metzius that comes out afterwards. But when seichel is mishtalshel from seichel, that's the inyan of ha'ora from the ilah becomes the alul. Ha'ora from the Rav becomes the seichel of the Talmud. So,
Ramoshe, I have a good question here.
Yes.
Just maybe it's a question of terminology, but the first oifen, when it's olul is not the same as ilah, it almost sounds like in other places it says siba and misubav, which is different as opposed to ilah olul.
Yes.
Would it
Correct.
be the same thing?
Correct. He mentioned that. Yes. Right. He mentioned that. But he's going to talk later still more about the inyan of siba mesuvav. We're going to talk about that later again. But yeah, there's two oifanim in ilah v'alul. One inyan in ilah v'alul is that it's a different metzius. The alul is a different metzius, and one is that it's ha'ora of the ilah. And so the example midos from binah, that's when it's different metzius, and when it's ha'ora seichel from the seichel to the Talmud from the seichel of the Rav. That's what he explained in the previous perek, in perek lamates. In any event, when we are talking about the inyan of ha'ora, we mean that the chitzonius of the inyan is nimshach. Right, the chitzonius of the inyan is nimshach, not the etzem itself. It's only ha'ora from the inyan. Okay, and that's what we're going to explain further in Perek Mem. All right, so Perek Mem, as you can see, Perek Mem, v'oifen Beis be'ilah v'alul, hu be'inyan ilah v'alul b'moichin gufa. That's the ilah and alul in the moichin. And he explains it more by arichus now. When the Rab wants to give up something, he's makabel, he wants to mashpia a certain inyan, he can't mashpia the inyan the way it is in his seichel. He's got to mitzamtim the inyan and only give the ha'ora to his talmid. Otherwise, the talmid will never understand. He doesn't have the intellectual capacity at this point in time to be able to chap the seichel harav. Hari aseichel nishba el makabel enu hus acher mi aseichel shel mashpia. He can't mashpia the seichel k'mo. He has to only mashpia ha'or of the seichel. Is the ha'or of the seichel a different inyan? No, it's not a different inyan. That's the difference between binah and chochmah, as he's going to go on and explain. The ha'or or the hashpah from binah is it's a different inyan. The midois come out as a different inyan from binah. The inyan of midois, medida v'chulu is the opposite of binah, which is his rachvus, right? Mida losha medida. Okay, he goes on. We'll explain it more in subsequent memorim as well. V'nimshach miseichel. So when we're talking about the second oifen in ilah v'alu, it's ha'or. V'nimshach haseichel mi'amashpia lo miguf v'atzmus hamoichin sheloi ki mebchinas chitzonius shu gam ken ha'ora. It's only ha'ora that goes to the talmid. The chol ha'ora sheba b'chinas ilah v'alu, any ha'ora that comes in an inyan of ilah v'alu, be'echer shekam ha'ilah hu b'chinas ha'ora levad. The ilah itself is not the ilah itself is not the mohusa inyan. He'll explain what he means by this shortly. Okay, so he explains over here the or lagabe ma'or enu b'chinas ilah v'alu. That when we're talking about the or that comes out of the ma'or, that's not ilah v'alu. Why? What do you describe that as? The order that comes from the ma'or is not ilah v'alu. It's not cause and effect, right? Or it's not cause and effect. It's rather the inyan of gilui min ha'etzem. It's the element etzem is misgale, but ba'oifen mamela, and it's misgala only ba'oifen shel ha'ora. So the oir itself is already ha'ora. Even though it's true that the gilu is lefi ha'etzem, lefi oifen ha'etzem. The oil is not the same as the etzem. It's ba'en aroch to the etzem. Nevertheless, even though it's ba'en aroch, ba'eichus, nevertheless, it's ha'ora min ha'etzem. O sheba al yedei tzimtzum, u'b'chinas siluk ha'ora atzmi, the memela hu ba'en aroch. Since the ma'or is mistalik, and when we say mistalik, we don't mean siluk. When we're talking about the tzimtzum harishon, we don't mean siluk mamish. We mean helem, at least according to the Alter Rebbe. According to the Gra, it's siluk mamish. But according to the Alter Rebbe, it's only helem. Helem ha'or, in fact, not even helem ha'or. In any event, or shabal the tzimtzum b'chinas siluk ha'or asmi the memela halu b'ein aroch. Now what comes out afterwards is b'ein aroch. Aval ha'ora sheba b'chinas ilah v'alu, but ha'ora that itself becomes ilah v'alu, which is like the kav, for example, becomes the inyan of ilah v'alu. Ta'ai b'chinas erech. V'adei slabshus ha'ila lahamtzias ha'alu, when the ilah is mislabish in a lower madrega in order to produce the alu, be'echech sha'ilu gam ken ha'ora levad. It must be that if the ilah can be mislabish in something below it, it must be that the ilah itself is also only a ha'or, it's not the mahus. Why? Because mahus can never be mislabish in something else. Anyway, this is just sort of an inyan b'derech agav, and the ikka inyan is going to explain again. Was there with these halus ha'alu who al yedei sheyesh k'tzas hasoga miha'ilah b'ha'alu. There is, in other words, the Talmud is masik somewhat seichel harav. Otherwise, the Rav would not be able to be mashpia anything to me. We're talking a different language, right? The Talmud must be able to be masik something of seichel harav. Now, he gives an example of this, and an interesting example, which actually comes from Tikkunei Zohar, or the Hakdama to Tikkunei Zohar, as he'll explain. When the ha'oras hamoich is nimshach b'leiv, That's called binah, liba, uba halev mevin. That's a lotion of the Tikkunei Zohar introduction, Akdome, to the Tikkunei Zohar. And binah, uba halev mevin, in other words, it's through binah that the lev comes to Havana, that the lev is mevin, whatever it is mevin. But what is that? Nevertheless, that's a hislapshus of seichel in the midah. But nevertheless, as we'll see, it arouses the midah. When the ilah is malubish in the alul, then you can have the inyan bina ubahalev mevin. V'hainu she'ora moichin ba b'chinis islapshus yos musag umurgash b'leiv. Therefore, it's reduced, but it's nevertheless be'erech ela. Right? It's be'erech ela, and he's going to explain this a little bit more. The same thing is true when you have a mishpia makabel. It's not that the makabel is completely a different metzias from the, like we discussed previously, when the midos emerge from bina. Now, when it's mashpia and makabel, the makabel is makabel something in the mashpia. Therefore, there has to be epis and erech of some sort or another. The mashpia makabel, hare seichel makabel masig seichel mashpia. That eventually it could be that the seichel of the makabel becomes equal to the seichel of the mashpia, and could even possibly surpass it. That can happen. The kiruva alul el ilah, and the closeness of the alul to the ilah, humashem masig yoiser es ilah. The more the alul is masig the ilah from the ilah, the closer they become, so to speak. And he gives another example. When a Talmud is ma'ayin and meyagea is atzmoi. In other words, he works very hard to understand the seichel that the mashpia has given him. And he comes to the depths of the inyan yoiser. That's the alul coming closer to the ilah. The alul is coming closer to the mashpia, right? The mushpa is becoming closer to the mashpia until there could be even an identity of mushpa and mashpia. In other words, there's a dveikus between the two. In any event, I want to get a little bit further, and then I'm going to tie it into the inyan of his boinanus in a minute. Only they say that the alul is oile to the mashpia, to the ilah. In other words, he doesn't think like the makabel anymore. He doesn't think like the velor madrega. His hasoga has changed to become like the seichel of the mashpia. Of the mashpia. And that's the whole inyan of zichuch seichel, that the makabel becomes closer to the mashpia by being mezachich seichel. The same thing can happen if the truth is, the same thing can, the truth be told, it can also happen with the midos. The midos can become like midos of seichel. In other words, they can become midos the gadlus, right? Which is not the inyan of the midos shebelev, the midos shebemurgash. These become midos sichlios. In other words, afopi that they midos that are run by seichel. They're not just they're not just a ha'ora from seichel, but they become an inyan sichli almost. They don't become a hergish atzmon. He's going to explain more. You don't feel the midas so much. Why not? Because you don't feel zich. The ikka in your midas is to feel oneself. Hargish is atzmoy. That's why it's called medida. It's medidas atzmi. How do I relate to this particular thing? That's an inyan of midos. And you find this often by, I teach classes, I teach the men, I teach the women as well. And very often the ikka question that women ask, interestingly enough, is how does it relate to me? Like what's ma inyan etzli? Like what is it? What does this mean to me? Right? Not what's the etzeb inyan, but how does the inyan relate to me? That's a midas kind of inyan. That's why women are much more shaykh, obviously, to the inyan of midas. All of this is shaykh only in ha'ora, not the muhus. Because the etzem, and particularly when we're talking about the inyan of chochmah, which is essentially what we're talking about now, The ha'ora from chochmah is what we're talking about. So essentially, chochmah is l'mayla mehasoga. That's why it's chochmah, not binah. Binah is masig, chochmah l'mayla mehasoga. We can understand this on a higher madrega. The Hishtalshlus ilah ba'alu shaykh rak ba'orein soif shenoide metzius of lemuhusay. The whole inyan of ilah ba'alu, in other words, the whole inyan of amshochas akav, etc., and the or pnimi is shaykh in the inyan of metzius, but not mahus. Mahus is not mishtalshel. It's only the metzius the inyan is mishtalshel, and that we can understand the Hishtalshlus of it. The beginning of metzius the orein so baruchu shaykh hasoga. V'sham shaykh inyan mishtalshel sha'alu masi is ilah. The alul has epis shaykhs to the ilah. Aval ba'atzmus, when you're talking about atzmus, enu musag, v'enu shaykh inan ilah ba'alul. It's not shaykh. And not, if it's not shaykh ilah ba'alul, it's not shaykh islabshus. So what's the difference then between the oyer of chochmah, when the oyer of chochmah is meir something, and the oyer of binah is meir? The oyer of binah is mishtalshel, and it's mislabish. But the Or Chochmah is not mishtalshel mislabish. It becomes makif on the inyan itself, and as it says in Tanya Perik Lamed Hay in the Hagor, when it's talking about the Bechinah of Chochmah, hu levade hu ve'en zulasoi zohi madrekas of Chochmah. Hu levade hu ve'en zulasoi means something that can't be musag, right? It's not musag. Hu levade hu ve'en zulasoi. It's not musag at all. That's the in of what chochmah is really about, and chochmah is shoyre hashros chochmah. So there's actually a famous sefer from Yitzhak Eismi Hommel called Ma'im HaShiflus V'Hasimcha. Where he describes in the beginning prokim, and then later on also in the Sefer, he describes the differences between the Kabbalah of the Ramak, the Arizal, and the Baal Shem Tov. Essentially, he says like this, that when you're talking about the Kabbalah of the Ramak, all the Ramak is talking about is the inyan of Ishtalshlus, the inyan of Metzias, the inyan of Oilimus, right? That's what he talks about, Ishtalshlus. Ishtalshlus, Oilimus, Milamala, Lamata, B'chulu, and that's the Ramak's Torah. That's the Ramak's Torah in Kabbalah. That's what he knew. He didn't speak about the inyan of Islapshus. Along comes the Arizal, and Arizal talks about Islapshus. What's the inyan of Islapshus? Islapshus is not just the Hishtalshlus of the lower Madrega from the higher, but how the higher Madrega affects the lower on a regular basis, on a continual basis. How the higher inyan is mislabish in the lower inyan and guides it and moves it and does and so on and so forth. And therefore, how the inyan, let's say, of binah is malubish in the midos, in someone who has mature midos, right? The inyan of havona hanasoga is what guides and what guides and limits and directs the midos in the proper way. Then along comes the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov talks about the inyan of Ashra. That's dafka, the inyan of chochmah, which is not musag, and therefore certain inyonim can't really be explained in oisius. They have to be sort of misgale, like by in a sense, more ruach hakodesh. Interesting. I was just reading a mimer. That's the inyan of Ashra. Hashros Ruach HaKodesh. That's why the expression that's used for Ruach HaKodesh. Now, I was just reading an essay by Rabbi Hillel Miparich, where he explains different kinds of his boinanus. He went to the Mittler Rebbe and he was trying to figure out like how you incorporate these boinanus of Kabbalah. In other words, all the different inyonim in that Kabbalah says about tefillah, that this particular word is hoyed, and that one's malchus, and that's netzach, and that's tiferes, and all these inyonim, and partzufim, and all kinds of other inyonim. By the way, the Arizal talks about partzufim, which is mislapshim zebazeh, mashayin kain the spherois is hishtalshlus. Hislapshus is to do with partzufim. In any event, Reb Hillel talks about the inyan of his boinanus. And often his boinanus, he asked the Mittler Rebbe, how do I reconcile all of these inyonim, as it says in Kabbalah? And the Mittler Rebbe told him that the derech is as follows: before davening, you go through the entire Seder Hishtalshlus, milamala lamata, and at every madrega of Seder Hishtalshlus, you have to mavatal that madrega to the etzem inyan of elokus. how that madrega is mavutal to the etzem inyan of Elokus. So next generation, Reb Hillel asked the same question of the Tzemach Tzedek. And Tzemach Tzedek said to him, yes, what the Mittler Rebbe said is correct. That's one oifen in his boinus, but it's the inyan of the oifen in his boinus in the inyan of Metzius, the Metzius of the Yishtalshlus, the Metzius of Oilimus, the Metzius of Spherois. But then there's his boinus in inyan of Mahus, which is an inyan in his boinus in Torah, rather than in the Bria, right? Bria, including the entire side of Yishtalshlus, not just Oilam Bria, but the inyan of the Bria. Masha'enka in the Ika inyan of Torah, that's not an inyan of binah, hishtalshlus, it's an inyan of chochmah, lamalim hishtalshlus. It's the etzem inyan elokus, and that's the inyan of Torah. Therefore, he said that the best thing to do is learn a mimer, whatever mimer appeals to you, and think it over before davening. Think over the mimer as it is, the seder of the mimer, preferably in the oasis of the mimer if you can, but in any event, think over the inyan or an inyan in the mimer, and that's your hachona for davening. And then the inyan of Elokus is mizgalet to you, like sort of like matan Torah. It's milamala lamata, right? It's not milamata lamayla like the avoid of the Mittler Rebbe. Said the avoid of the Mittler Rebbe was good for his times. Today, people don't have the moichin, and the Tzemach Tzedek was talking in his time. Don't have the moichin for the Mittler Rebbe's. Most people don't have the moichin for the Mittler Rebbe's type of his boinus, and therefore he gave an alternative. Very interesting mime from Reb Hillel about yichidus that he had with Mittler Rebbe and with Tzemach Tzedek about the inyan his boinus. In any event, to get back to the text. That's the whole inyan of Seder of what's Lamalam Seder to Moichin the Abba. The inyan of Chochmah is Lamalam Seder Shtalshlus. The inyan the Hina Yedua, the Chochmah binah, Chub, Hein Re'iyah Ushmiya. Two different inyanim. Re'iyah and Shmiya. Re'iyah is inyan the Mahus, right? Masha Enka and Shmiya is only the Metzias. You don't actually see the inyan, you just heard about it, so to speak. It's not what you actually experience yourself. It's not the Etzema inyan. It's only the Ha'ora of the inyan. That Shmiya is not nearly the same as Re'iyah. Re'iyah is much more true. It's much closer to the Neshama. Masha'en Kain, Shmiya is you heard about, but you didn't experience it itself. The Shmiya hu mirachok. It's from a distance. You know about it, that it was there. You know that it was there, but you only know that. You don't know it, right? V'riya mikaroiv, shuri is ha'etzem hadavar, jezeu inyan chochmah, shu his amsus hadavar. The inyan becomes emes to him. Why? Because he feels the inyan as he experienced it. It's not that he heard about it, but he actually experienced it himself. Chochmah, much higher madrega, and therefore it's bechinas emes. His amsus. Lo mitzad hasoga. It's not because he thought about it or he came to some kind of intellectual conclusion about it. He sees the inyan as it is. As we say, as written elsewhere, the chochmah, you're seeing the thing as it is, not the thing as it's grasped in the kalim of binah, but rather the oir itself. The mahus of chochmah. B'chochmah yesh gam ken eses spheres. Beginnens gar de chochmah hu re'iyah be'etzem hadavar. She'enu shayach adayin lemidas chulu. Kam b'midas sheb'chochmah, which we explained before, midas sheb'chochmah is the inyan of Yisrael Saba, right? Tvuna is the midas sheb'binah, and Yisrael Saba the midas sheb'chochmah. So gam midas sheb'chochmah and gam ken beginnes is amsus. They're also in a state of emes shelamal mi hasoga, because they're the midas of chochmah, but nevertheless they don't have the same isamsus as the gar, as the moichin of Abba. Rav. Why was Rav in a state of shtika? Because it chapped an inyan that Alpi, he saw the etzema inyan, and Alpi that the other chachom didn't agree with Rav. And he didn't explain himself. The reason he didn't explain himself because it didn't come into seichel. It's lamalim in seichel. It's an inyan of this is the emes, and I can't explain why, but that's the way it is. The Mikum Makom lo hadabe, and he wouldn't retract his shita. This is the way it is because that's the way I saw it. His amis etzloi, by him it became emes to him. Shehu asur, that a certain thing, well, I forget what the Indian was, that was asur. Alpha that other chachomim said was mutar. Rak shelo tam musag al zeh. He couldn't explain why, but he knew that mitzad emes Indian, that's the way it was. He saw that that's the way it was. V'hanu b'chinas amidish b'chochmah sheheim b'chinas his amsus l'mayla mi'asoga. That's the Indian of emes that transcends hasoga. Hasoga can explain the emes, but he sees the emes. Okay. All of that is the Indian that we wanted to explain. Now we have to go back to the beginning of the Maimer. The beginning of the Maimer is the Indian of Pashas Matos Maseh, which is the Indian of Nedorim, and what this has to do with Nedorim. So we'll explain this and who the Nedorim, the koyach to be matir and neder, was given to. It was given to Rosh HaMatos, to the people of the Rosh HaMatos essentially formed the Batei Dinim of their particular Shevet, or the bigger Beis Din. There was various sizes of Beis Din. There was a Beis Din of 3, the Batei Dinim of 23, and there was the Beis Din of Sanhedrin, the Machlokes in the Gemara, where the 70, 71. Our conclusion is 71. I think Rabbi Meir said 70, and the Shekhinah was the 71st. Moshe Rabbeinu. In any event, 71. So that's the Indian of. So we're coming now to explain the Indian of Torah's Nedorim. While Pian al Yulam Mashi, Parson Nedorim Nemra al Rosh HaMatos. Why was it set up to Rosh HaMatos? We told to them Zeh Hadavar. In other words, when you Zeh. You can only say zeh when you can point to it, when you can actually see it. If you can't see it, then you have to say ko amar Hashem. But when you say zeh, then you point into the etzem in itself, not ko. The Nedorim haim binah. Now he's going to explain this al pi Kabbalah Oisius. Melech b'china zoh. Zeranpin is called Melech because he's a Melech for Malchus, right? It's Melech lagabe Malchus. Malchus is the Inyan of Melucha, and Zo is the Inyan of the Melech. So what's Chaya Melech? Chaya Melech is binah, right? The etzem Inyan of the Melech, the fact that he's alive, or whatever is the Chayus of the Melech, the etzem of the Melech is bechinas binah. The Chocham hamatir is a neder who bechinas chochmah. So a chocham, obviously, he's called a chocham. He's matir and neder because he's on a higher madrega than the neder itself. The neder is only within his binah. The chocham is matir the neder. He's higher than the inyan of neder. He's a chocham l'malam binah. Inyan hu dehina call it dvorim agashmim and tachas mem shelet klipas noiga. He's going to explain it now in simple oisius. All of the inyanim in the world, all the inyanim in creation are. In Yonim Gashmi, in other words, are from Klipas Noiga. They're Tachas Memsheles Klipas Noiga. Klipas Noiga rules over them. In other words, basically they're on a very low madrega of Kedusha. Kedusha, yes, Noiga. Klipas Noiga is not Klipas Tamayas. It's a level of Kedusha, but a very low level of Kedusha. Very small, a very low madrega in oil. Shenoiga Mu'urav Tovera. The inner of Noiga is that it's a mixture of Tov and Ra. Sometimes the Tov is Nichal and Kedusha. But the Ra is sometimes descends into Klippus Atameis. While Cain, Nikres, and therefore Noiga is called Lahat Acherev HaMisapeches. Why Lahat Acherev HaMisapeches? Because the Lahat, in other words, it's the union of literally a lahat means a blade, but it can also mean a flame, right? But it's misapeches, it's a blade that's misapeches because it's mishapech mitov l'ra, mira l'tov. It could be either way, right? And that's why it's called lahat achera misapeches. All inyonim in Gashmis are a mixture of this inyan of Tovera. For example, physical food. When a person eats food for the sake of him, l'shem shamayim, mizbar hanitzois hatoiv sheboy. Then, because the food is in a klipas noiga, the toiv in klipas noiga, which is a nitzot of elokus, is oil lamaila, and it is goes to a higher madrega, and it's nichlal in kedusha. Moitzed l'chayes be'ezak ha'torah va'avoida, and it adds to his chayus in Torah and avoida. If he ate whatever he ate, bebechinas kedusha. Now, you're probably, I don't know if you've ever seen this actually boil, or you've maybe seen videos of it, or you've just heard about it. A lot of the Polish Rebbes, you see that when it comes to a tish, they bring this, like usually, for instance, an enormous Yerushalmi kugel, right? They bring this huge piece to the Rebbe, and he takes a spoon or a fork or whatever it is, and he takes off a little bit from this from this Yerushalmi kugel, just a little bit, and then before he puts it in his mouth, it's like it takes a while before he puts it in his mouth. Why? Because he's trying to eat it l'shem shamayim. It's all these people around. It's very hard to do. I'm assuming we're talking about an honest situation over here, not just pretending. We're talking about a Rebbe b'derech klal, and to put it in his mouth and eat it l'shem shamayim takes time. It has to bring himself to the matzav nafshi that he can eat this thing l'shem shamayim. Whether he does or he doesn't in the end, I don't know. I'm not a boichen levavois. That's up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in any event, you sometimes see that as an inyan that the person is trying to concentrate on doing a thing l'shem shamayim, and therefore when he does that moisif in him, chayus in his moichen and in his midas, as Chazal say. Wine, chamra, and reicha, incense, or good smelling, whatever it is, something that smells good, perfume, or whatever it is. Pikhin make a person smarter. Chazal were very makpid about this in of reach. There should be a good reich around. Probably because places were much more dirty in those days and had to sort of overcome the bad smell of things. But chamer berecha pikhin. Ad lo achilna bisra the Torah. That's, or I should say it actually the Torah, even though it's pronounced the Torah. Ad lo achilna bisra the Torah. Even until I ate the, this is one of the Chachomim says in the Zohar, until I ate the flesh of an ox. Torah is an ox. That's why we call it Torah. We don't want to say it Torah. You might make a mistake with a hay on the end. Yeah, it's the basar of a shore, right? Ada achina bisr the Torah. Lord tzalina dasoi. Until I ate the flesh of an ox. In other words, he ate a geschmacka steak. Maybe he didn't get a geschmack out of it, but Lord tzalina dasoi. His das was not clear. Why? Because when a person eats something l'shem shamayim, it's gives him tzlilas hadas, right? Gives him a clarity of kop. Okay. When the opposite happens, when a person eats something in order just simply to fulfill his taivas, he brings the food down to the level of the animal, right? Or rather, he brings himself down to the level of the animal. Ukamaimer, as the expression goes, Malay krisa zina bisha. He fills his stomach with zina bisha. Zina bisha means with waste product. Let's put it that way. I don't want to say rude words in the shir, but zina bisha means what you do when you go to the bathroom. That's zina bisha, right? As a zan, a species which is bish, which is evil, right? Evil in yoni. In other words, waste products. And therefore the avoid is essentially to push away the ra, the noiga. Because again, we said noiga is mu'urav tov ra. We have to push away the ra and we have to makarav the toiv. How do you push the ra of noiga away? By not delighting in it, like in the tanugim that people, you see these pictures of Biden eating ice cream, with tremendous taiva and relish and so on and so forth. That's not the way we're supposed to do it. Now, I'll grant you that most of us are no better. Probably when we come to eat, we just eat like sort of automatically. We don't think about it, but we should. that pushes away the ra. Only there, when he has kavona l'shem shamayim, when a person is eating something that brings the nitzot tzatoiv out of klipas noiga and oil into kedusha. Va'avoida hu tchilas atfila, hu tchila betfila. Sorry, va'avoida he tchila betfila. That starts off with the inyan of tefillah. Shu inyan ha'izboinus be'elokus. The izboinus in elokus, as I explained before, there's two oifanim in izboinus. The middle Rebbe's oifen, which is the elokus that was boirer the oilemus, the elokus that's mishtalshel in the oilemus, and then the elokus as it is in Torah. The Tzemach Tzedek preferred the latter, it seems, because it's dafka. He explains over there, dafka l'neshamas nemuchos. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek said. The second oifen is for lowly neshamas nemuchos. Shvinin is bonus be'elokus. Al dezeh ba'al b'chinas ava v'kiruv le'elokus. Brings the person closer to the Eibishter. In other words, is me'oir ava and yira. Shetachlit chefta v'retzoyna hu be'elokus. Lot the yirtze b'gashmis v'chumiyas ha'olam. He doesn't want the gashmis, the chumiyas, etc., etc. V'gam b'inyon ha'olam, even in the inyon ha'olam, shu muchrach b'hem. You have to eat, something you have to eat. You have to eat in order to survive, eat and drink, and wear clothing and so on. So and therefore, he's makar of the nitzotz of elokus, and ma'al is the nitzotz in it. As we explained, the spark is nichla and kedusha, the klippa is pushed away. It can also happen that the ra of noiga is nichla and kedusha. This seems to be an argument between Chabad and Breslov. Interestingly enough, I was having an argument with a Breslov on this inyan, or discussion rather, it was actually from Dr. Unger. You probably, Eliezer, you probably know him, Dr. Unger. He's a big Breslover. And he maintains that Rabbi Nachman's teachings are able to mataher even the shalosh klippas of Tameis. So I started to look into it a little bit, and I see that the Alter Rebbe actually addresses this issue. And he says that it's true that on occasion you can mataher even the gimel klippas of Tameis. For example, that's the inyan of paraduma. Yeah, the whole inyan of paraduma is to retire tumas meis, gimel klippus atameis. But nevertheless, it's not a steady part of the seder of avoida. It's not the regular avoida that a person has to do. The regular avoida he has to do is separate the tov and ra of noiga, push away the ra of noiga, mekarev the toiv, and ma'ale the toiv, and that's what most people can do. There are those that can do a bit more than that. They can even mavare the ra of noiga. They can bring even the ra of noiga into kedusha, as he just said. Shegam the noiga nichal b'kedusha. Kmo b'Shabbos. Shamu razal mitzvah la'angoy be'achila v'shtia. It's a mitzvah to delight in the Shabbos, achila v'shtia. That's when you have your dessert and your chocolate and cake and this and then the other. Hopefully not during the week, but in any event, that's when we mile those in Yonim. Had Adam HaRishon waited for Shabbos to partake of the Eitz Hadas Tovera, we wouldn't have all of these problems with tithers and so on and so forth. Everything would have been hunky-dory. We would be able to mile the Indian of Eitz Hadas into Kedusha. In other words, Mavara the Ra of Noiga and bring it up into Kedusha, and we wouldn't have had all the problems that we're having with Golos and all these other Yonim and Tivers, and the whole Indian of Ra. So that's what we're trying to do on Shabbos to a large extent, is to Mavarer, and not just Mavarer, but bring the Ra into Kedusha, because the mitzvah la'angoy v'achila v'shtia. We can use the achila and shtia in a positive way. V'hu shegam ataynu gashmi u'madregas Kedusha b'Shabbos. Even tanu gashmi is on a madrega Kedusha. She'enu tanu gashmi ki im k'moi tanu geloki. It becomes tanu geloki, not tanu gashmi, if it's done with kavona, obviously. Just I'm eating ice cream on Shabbos is probably not going to cut the mustard, as they say. The this is not just iskafia, it's in isapcha. Iskafia is to push away the ra. Isapcha is to transform the ra. Inyan isapcha, shara nepach l'toiv, and asitanu gilokichulu. And there were certain tzaddikim that this was part of their avodah. They said Rabbi Nachman Chernobyl, that was one of his inyonim in avodah, was dafka this particular inyan, to mahapech tainu gashmi into tainu ruchni, into tainu geluki. In any event, in over nabiru anal shetzichem lischreis huk shara yeshnu metzias. When you push away the ra, this is the ra that's been metzias. V'hainu kshatanu gagashmi hu betayva gashmis. V'har is a magashim kanal. It's magashim the person. If he partakes of it, it's magashim him. So you want to push it away. But tzichem lischreis, it has to be pushed away. V'hainu shelo yisanik bazeh. That's the derech during the week. But on Shabbos, the Inyan is to mile the oinig in it into a Shabbos dikan oifen, into an Inyan kedusha. V'zeu b'chinas iskafia shekoife u'machnia esara. Aval b'chinas isabcho, which happens on Shabbos, shara nepach l'toiv hanu sheba tainug ein bo shum time agashmius. He doesn't feel a gashmius in it. He's eating it, as there are people that say, before eating dessert, l'shem, l'shem kedusha Shabbos, or l'shem oinig Shabbos, or there's various other expressions that people use when eating or partaking of something like this, l'shem kedusha Shabbos or whatever. In other words, that the tainug is at least one has in mind that the tainug should be not a tainug gashmi but tainug ruchni. She'en bo shum tainug gashmi is klal v'adarabu hu tainug eloki. Hari hara nepach l'kedusha chulu. Zeu hefresh bein avodah the chol avodah Shabbos. It's the difference between chol and Shabbos. Dini yedu sheshimei chol ein bechinas yomin dezo. In other words, the 6 days of the week are the days of Zoh, of Zer Anpin, because the 6 midos in Zer Anpin, and the inyan of the Asher Bara Elokim Laso is Lasake, and there's the inyan of Tikkun, and that's the inyan of pushing away the Ra during the week. And that inyan of Asa is the inyan of Lasake, and he was Masaken, or rather, we have to do the Tikkun of the inyanim that were left, so to speak, incomplete. They were not, they were mixed with Tov and Ra, and we have to do the separation, and that's the avodah during the week. On Shabbos, separation is Asur, boirer is Asur on Shabbos. So the inyan is to take the Tov and be mala the Tov into Kedusha. V'hamoichin the chol hen moichin the ima. Shekol the umadregas ishtalshlus. Shezev v'chinas the elokus. As we explained above, the alkain avodah bazeh v'chinas is kafi levad. Chulu. Aber Shabbos, Shabbos moichin the Abba. Shabbos moichin the Abba. Shalamal mishtalshlus. Who bechinas hamahus the elokus. A whole different ball game. The avodah madrega zu who bechinas is hapcho. Then on Shabbos, it's not just iskafia. It's the in and of it's hapcho. V'hainu shakol hu elokus. So we would have to say, therefore, that when the Rebbe is not putting the food in his mouth and he's trying to, the Polish Rebbe, and he's trying to get up the kavona, he's trying to get up the kavona of his hapcha, not his kafir, on Shabbos. He's eating the Shabbos kigel. The hainu shakol hu elokus, gam inyonim agashmis, shatani hu eloki. K'mo atzadik oichel l'soiva nafsho. What's the tzaddik eating for? He's not eating for l'soiva bitnoi, the satisfaction of his stomach, but l'soiva nafsho, with the satisfaction of his neshama, his nefesh. B'derech klal zeh gam ken ha'hefresh ben biru de tefila shemilamata lamayla, which is the avodah of tefillah, la biru de Torah shu milamala lamata. And this is what's hinted to in the Maimer Reb Hillel that I mentioned, or the Yechidas. We went to the Mittler Rebbe, and the Mittler Rebbe was talking essentially about the union of our tefillah, which is milamata lamala, and therefore you have to mispoint on the entire Seder Shtalshlus and how it's bottled to Elokus. Masha Einkein, the Tzemach Tzedek, you've been given Torah in the form of a Maimer, and the Torah is milamala lamata, and therefore the biru is a much easier biru. All right, now we're going to explain the Nedorim. When a person makes a neder, That brings about the inner precious. What's precious? Precious is to separate a person from Gashmias. In other words, Vahainu, as we said before. That's what iskafia is all about. In order to do iskafia, you have to separate yourself on occasions from the thing legamri. For example, someone who was into drugs, for example, just to take a very group example, someone is into drugs or was into alcohol and became an alcoholic or a drug addict. Afterwards, he can't take a little bit of drugs and be mile of the Indian. He's got to keep away from it completely. There's no way that a person who was an addict or an alcoholic can now take the Indian and use it out of the kedusha. Unless maybe, I don't know, there might be very rare circumstances where this is possible, but it's probably not possible. And therefore, a person has to keep completely away from any alcohol if he was an alcoholic, any drugs if he was a drug addict. So avoid b'derech iskafia l'famim tzarich b'derech prishus legamri. Hu kshiyoder b'nafshoy she'i efshar lo lif'ol b'nafsho sheyeneh mihadavar hagashmi rak b'kavod l'shem shamayim. That he can take the l'chaim on alcohol and could be l'shem shamayim. For someone who was an alcoholic, it's an almost impossible task because he could slip back very easily. And unfortunately, it happens to people who were alcoholics and then went through the whole 9 yards to get out of it, the 12 steps or whatever it's called, the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous, and they got out of alcohol, and then they think they can just say, an l'chaim on somebody's birthday and then right back into alcoholism. Unfortunately. Why? Because you have to know whether you can go back into such a thing. You can't really do it l'shem shamayim, don't do it at all. Therefore, a person is afraid is going to go right back into the union of essentially what is essentially klippa. And therefore he has to separate himself completely. Yeah, it ends over there. Okay, good. That's what Nadorim are all about. That when a person makes a neder, it's not a neder to not have something which is asur. That's already asur to you. You don't need to make it asur. The neder is to make something which is mutar, but not a mitzvah necessarily, asur. Okay. It's a question. It's not enough what the Torah makes asur to you. We have Tariag mitzvahs. The Torah tells you what's mutar, what's asur. That's not enough for you. So the answer is no. For this particular person, it's not enough. Why not? For that person, it's impossible to raise up such a thing. There are people that are vegetarian for this reason. I'm talking about from people that are vegetarian for this. They feel that they can't raise up the nitzos of kedusha that there is in meat, for example. Now, just derech hagav, it's much easier to understand. Perhaps during the week they can't, but l'choyer on Shabbos they should be able to. But anyway, go and argue with a vegetarian is like arguing with a brick wall. It won't work. In any event, haru oisra alav b'mesh mamshich alav or makif to kedusha shenasek a korban. Right? It becomes like a korban, which the person who's making the korban doesn't participate, doesn't eat anything of the korban. Right? He's not eating of the korban oila. He's not going to participate in it at all. He pushes it away. He's not gonna have anything to do with it, even though it's essentially al pitor it's mutar. That is the avodah binah. Avodah he v'chnis iskafia. Binah beikar is the inyan of iskafia. But chochmah is not the inyan of iskafia. Chochmah is the inyan of ishapcha. Aval bechinas al chochmah shal dezeh hara nepach letoiv. It's transformed completely. That's the chocham who has the ability to release the person from their neder. Everything becomes good. Come on, in other words, what was previously asur is now mutar. The achila on Shabbos, it doesn't make the person more gashmi. Well, it can. But obviously, we're talking about someone who has a little bit of forethought, and before he eats, he has kavonas, and he says a brocha, and he says it with kavona, and so on and so forth. And he has in mind that the Indian of Achila of Shabbos excuse me, is like offering a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, and it's eating a velokus and a mitzvah and so on and so forth. And that's why he's eating. In any of it, we can understand the eating. That's why when it comes to Nadorim, it uses the term zeh. Zeh, marube, it's boy, voimer zeh. He points with his finger and says zeh. It's beginnes re'iyah, beginnes chochmah. When the Nevi'im spoke about things that this is, they didn't use the word zeh, they used the word ko. Why? Because it's more or less, it's like this, it's not exactly this. Like for instance, in the vision of Yecheskel, ke mare Adam. It's not mare Adam, right? It's ke mare Adam. in his vision of the Merkav and Perek Aleph of Yecheskel. Moshe, however, nistaba bezeh. Moshe could point to it, so to speak, point to it with his finger and say, "This is what it is." Shugilo hamahus. Kenoide the Moshe begins a chochmah. Moshe and all the other Nevi'im were not on the madrega of Moshe Rabbeinu, obviously, and therefore their nevuah was bako, and Moshe Rabbeinu's was zeh Omar Hashem, as opposed to ko Omar Hashem. Leo is called Inyan Hatoras Nadorim, who dafka begins Gilo hamahus, to begins chochmah. Since the Indian of Hatoras Nadorim is the Chocham is mater neder, okay, Nemar kan zeh hadavar, and that's why I use the expression zeh and not the expression ko. But Nemar l'Rosh Hamatois dafka. Why dafka to the Rosh Hamatois? Dehina Yud Beis Shif Shvatim hen Shisha Midos dezo. Shem bechin Yud Beis Gvula Alachson. The heads of the Shvatim themselves were the Inyan of the Shisha Midos of Zo in two Ifanim. You have Chazak v'Rafeh, right? As you have with a dagesh and without a dagesh. So the inyonim of the spheros of Zohar can be b'choizik or they can be b'rafeh. They can be hard. In other words, if it's an inyan of Abba, it's an Abba which is aroused, or it can be where Abba, you have the midah of Abba, but it's not so much aroused. More the midah Gvura is aroused. Then Gvura would be chazak and Abba would be rapeh. Right? So that's where it works. So chazak and rapeh is 12. And these are called the 12 Gvula Alachson. The Gvula Alachson are the what do they call them? The meridians, I think is the right word. The meridians which join the 6 sides of space. If you have a cube, right? If you have a cube and the cube forms 6 sides, there's up and down, right and left, front and back. So that's 6 sides. So the meridians that join them are called the Yud Beis Gvula Alachson, right? The 12 borders of the cube that are called the meridians. And there's one going from front left to back right, right at the top and so on. And you can figure out how it goes. Okay. Whereas the Rosh Hamatos, the matos themselves are the Bechina of Zoh. In Chazak Urafeh, the mato is bechinas moichin dezo. She bechinas binah. That's in a binah. In other words, the Rosh Hamatos is on a high madrega. The himshich lahem Moshe. So they only bechinas binah, but now they need the in of chochmah to be mater and neder. The himshich lahem Moshe, but Moshe gave them this quality, this ability. Himshich lahem Moshe bechinas chochmah liyois bekoicham lahatiris neder. He gave them the ability to mater and neder. What's mater and neder? To mamshich chochmah. That's matir the neder. Hainu shebina hi mikomakom kli leora chochmah, and he was mamshich the in of chochmah. V'zeu v'yedaber Moshe al Rosh Hamatos dafka. Why does it say v'yedaber rather than vayomer or some other word for Moshe communicated with the Rosh Hamatos, but rather it uses the word vayedaber. What's the in of vayedaber? The in of a dabar echad lador v'ein shnei dabarim lador. There's one leader of the generation, not 2 leaders of the generation. The inyan of the word davar is related to the word dabar, which means to lead, as he explains now. V'zeu is dabar Moshe v'yedaber hu loshan hanhoga, to lead, to guide. Hanhoga v'hamshocha shemamshi b'chinas hachochma el Rosh Hamatos. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu did. He brought down the inyan to the of chochmah to the Rosh Hamatos, that they would be able to matir neder, and that's what this whole parsha of Nedorim is about. Matos Maseh, or rather, Matos is about that. He brought down to their madrega, which is the madrega moichin the ima. He brought down the koach chochmah. And that's the meaning of zeh hadavar. This is the inyan zeh hadavar. Hadavar hanhoga. In other words, the bechinas gilu hamahus the bechinas chochmah in binah. Shal zeh dafka bekoichem lahasidem lahatir saneder kulu. Okay, we'll just read the Kitzer, and this is the end of the Maimer. Kitzer v'oiven abeis hu kamo hashpos seichel shu ha'ora levad uba michitzonius. The inyan of inyan of ha'ora, it's not the etzem inyan, and therefore the ha'ora comes only as a chitzonius. Ha'ora, it's a radiance, it's not the thing itself. Shu gam ken rak ha'ora. L'chein is havus ha'alu hu aladei hasogas ilah. And therefore the alu comes about. The second way in which an alu can come about is not by reduction. As we said before, it's not by the same process of binah, the ishtalshalus, but rather this is the inyan of hasogas ilah, that the lower madrega is masik, the chitzonius of the upper madrega, umishave ke'erkoi, and it becomes like the ilah, ve'ilu ha'alu hu shemasik yoysa esa ilah. The more it's masik the ilah, the more it becomes like the ilah. Nase the bechinas dakus yoyser becomes much more refined until it comes to bechinas dveikus. All the enu shaykh ba'atzmi. This is all of this is nevertheless not shaykh in atzmi. Etzem is not mishtalshel. Etzem is not meir. It's only the chitonius, the ha'ora, it's the oira that's meir. It's not the etzem. V'zeu chochmah ubina ri'i u'shmiya, and that's the meaning of chochmah and binah, which is ri'i, as we explained before. Ri'a samahus and shmiya samatzias. Even the midas and chochmah are also an inyan of emes, even though they are midos. V'zeu yuvan in adorim shem binah, v'hetin adorim chochmah. V'izbayim ha'shakasu v'dabe Moshe el rosh ha'matos. Okay. That's the end of that mimer. Next week, we will start the next mimer. Any questions, Rabbi Isai? All right, so we'll stop here, and I'll post it on YouTube, Hasidus Decoded.